Well, good afternoon, everybody, on a warm, muggy afternoon here in Cambridge. I'm Bill O'Hearn. I'm the development director. I'm at home and your host for today. And Patricia Fara is in college in the Thorkill room. And we're pleased to have everybody here for our last live session of Digital Gala Week. And thanks to all of you who've been participating and asking good questions and watching. We really appreciate it. We have a number of recordings that will go on tomorrow. And I have to tell you that I've seen a preview of what Graham Ross has in store for us, and it's a real treat, so don't miss it. But we also have a real treat this afternoon. I know Patricia is known to, I imagine all of you, but I will introduce her again just in case. Patricia is an emeritus fellow of Clare College, and the job she enjoyed most in her whole life was being senior tutor for 10 years. She read physics at Oxford, but her academic subject now is the history of science. She has published several popular books, as well as appearing in TV and radio programs such as Melvin Bragg's In Our Time. Patricia first became interested in Joseph Banks over 20 years ago when she was awarded a fellowship in Australia to research his portraits. Her book, Sex, Botany and Empire, The Story of Carl Linnaeus and Joseph Banks, has recently been republished as a paperback. So Patricia's going to speak to us, and we're going to have some question and answer at the end. The way we do that is you put your questions in the chat, make sure you hit return so we see it, and we will take questions at the end. And as they come up, we'll have time to add some as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Patricia now, and I really appreciate you all being here.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it is such a treat for me to be here. It's the first time I've been back in Clare for 3 months, and if you forget about the scaffolding, the gardens are looking absolutely gorgeous, and I hope to welcome you all here next year when everything's back to normal. But today, this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about Joseph Banks, and it is the 200th anniversary of his death. And I've got up on the screen 3 different pictures of him to give you a sort of taster in advance. So on the left, you can see him as he was a famous botanist when he travelled to Australia with James Cook. On the right is him as a sort of more autocratic scientific administrator. He was president of the Royal Society for 42 years. And then the picture in the middle, which is my favourite, shows him with a Maori, and I put that there as an emblem of his imperial and ecological initiatives. So I think he's most famous, whoops, gone wrong already. He was most famous for his voyage round the world with James Cook when they went to Australia on this ship. This is a replica of the original Endeavour, and that was from 1768 to 1771. He's not now particularly well known in Britain, but he is extremely well known in Australia, where he's often celebrated as the first Australian scientist. And these, for any of you who've been to Australia, these Banksia flowers are extremely, extremely well known. And there's Botany Bay was named after him. There's Banks Villages, there's Banks apartment complexes. He really is a very well-known man. And the main message of the talk that I'm giving today is that science and exploration and mapping are not just straightforward intellectual activities, they're also very political. And unfortunately, I can't see your faces, so I don't know if any of you are laughing at this map or at least looking surprised, but I hope you are, because of course, for everybody English like me, it's upside down. And this is a political map that was produced in the 20th century by Australia to indicate that it is mere sort of historical accident that we usually see the world the other way up, because most of the explorers came from Europe during the last 2,000 years. So this is very much a political statement, and that's the emphasis, the underlying message of everything I'm going to be talking about today. And there, of course, is no sound scientific or geographical reason why the map shouldn't always be this way up. So I'm going to be dividing the talk into 4 parts. I've put them here in different colours. I'm going to start with just a brief outline of his life, just so you get a sense of what it was that he did and why he's important. And then the three main sections, I'm going to be talking about him as a traveller, and then as president of the Royal Society, and then as a section I called Metropolis and Empire. So starting with an outline of his life, you can tell by the education he received at Harrow, at Eton and Christchurch, Oxford, that he came from an incredibly wealthy family. He was very rich. I'm afraid he wasn't very smart. I don't think now he would have got into either Christchurch or into Clare. He was not known for his academic work, but right from a very small child, he became interested in botany. And he first learned about flowers from a book that his mother had on her dressing table. So after he graduated from Oxford with rather a mediocre academic performance, he went to live in London. His mother's house was near Chelsea Physic Garden, and he lived near there for a long while, until later on, he moved into the centre of London. He moved into Soho Square, and he had his offices there, and he lived there. And you can see from the picture that Soho Square looked then very different from how it does now. You can see there's a green patch in the middle with lots of sheep. So it was a very different sort of place. And then he was also a landowner. He owned a huge estate at Reesby Abbey in Lincolnshire. I can't show you a picture of the abbey because it was knocked down, and then now there's a 19th century mansion there. But he used to go down to Lincolnshire about 3 months in every summer. He was very active locally, so he's contributed to draining the fens, and he was a very well-known figure there as well. So this is just a very sketchy outline of the major events in his life, and I've color-coded them. So you can see there's 3 in green, that's for travel, when his first journey was to Newfoundland and Labrador, then the Endeavour voyage with Cook that he's most famous for, and then he went to Iceland and Scotland. Scotland was then often regarded as a foreign country, even though it wasn't. And as soon as he came back from Newfoundland and Labrador, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. So he was very young, he was only 23, and then later he became President of the Royal Society. And the 2 other main events I've singled out is when he married his wife, Dorothea, and they moved to Soho Square. And then he just stayed there for many decades. And then he was made a Knight of the Order of the Bath, which is one of the biggest distinctions that you can earn in this country. So that's the sort of outline of his life, so you know roughly how it ran. So I'm going to start talking now in my first section about Joseph Banks as the traveller. And you can see on the right is a modern cover, obviously, of the book that he published about his journey to Australia, some account of that part of New Holland and New South Wales. And I love this picture. It's a very famous painting by Stubbs. Of course, Stubbs is absolutely brilliant at painting horses, but he'd never seen a live kangaroo. Joseph Banks had brought back with him a kangaroo skin, but whoever the taxidermist was hadn't got it quite right. And if you've ever seen a live kangaroo, you know that they're not as balloon shaped as this. So Stubbs didn't get that one quite right. But the picture on the left is by Joshua Reynolds, England's most famous portrait artist at the time. And it was painted just a couple of months after he came back from Australia. And you see there's the globe in the background to illustrate his importance as a traveller. And most young men of his age were going on a grand tour to Italy. And he's actually wearing a red velvet cloak with a fur collar, which is exactly the sort of thing that young men used to wear in Italy. But he never went to Italy. He decided he was going to go around the whole world instead. And one thing I love about this picture is if you get really close to it, it's in the National Portrait Gallery, you can see the stubble on his chin, so indicating that he's a traveller, he's not just a desk man. And underneath that clenched hand on the desk, there's a quotation from Horace saying, we're going to sail the dark oceans again. So his first trip was to Newfoundland and Labrador. And the picture on the right, those birds are great auks, and he saw them, although they became extinct in the 19th century, so nobody's seen them now. He actually thought they were penguins, but presumably someone informed him that penguins are near Antarctic, not near the Arctic. And then as soon as he got back, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. which put him in an influential position for persuading the king, who was George III, to fund an expedition to go to Tahiti to measure the transit of Venus. So the transit of Venus is when the planet Venus comes in between the sun and the earth, and you can see it's like a little spot on the face of the sun. And it happens roughly every 100 years, but it happens twice, the space of about 8 years. So there'd been a transit in 1761. And so Banks was very cunning, and he went along to George III and said, this is a really important expedition because we need to know exactly how long it takes Venus to cross the sun, because that tells us how far the sun is away from the Earth. So it's a measure of the solar system. And he said at the previous eclipse, we, the English, didn't do very much, but the French were absolutely magnificent. And there was a huge competition between the French and the English. So as soon as Banks said that, the king was willing to fund the expedition. And there were expeditions from lots of different countries, and ostensibly, they were all cooperating scientifically in order to measure the transit of Venus, but in fact, they were also competing against each other because it was a matter of national prestige, who should send the biggest and the best expedition. So he set off with Cook in the Endeavour, and this ship, it looks enormous, but if you see it in a picture of it next to an ice floe, it looks pretty small, and they were setting off across oceans that hadn't been charted. It was also absolutely chaotic on board. It was very crowded. They had to take a lot of animals with them for food. They had to take all the water, or else sometimes they melted down ice floes instead. And then when Banks arrived, Banks paid for himself. He came with a team of about 10 assistants, all his servants and the people who were going to draw the flowers and all that sort of thing. And he came with 300 pounds of ammunition and 200 storage bottles and 30 large boxes. And it cost him a huge amount of money that he paid for himself. But on the other hand, it made him rather unpopular with the crew on the ship. So they headed off and they arrived in Tahiti, where they built this fort. You can see it's flying the British flag in the middle. They called it Fort Venus, and that's a sort of play on words, because it was called Fort Venus because they were going to measure the transit of Venus, but it also very rapidly became known as the Island of Love, and a couple of French expeditions had been there previously, so there was already a lot of the people were suffering from European sexually transmitted diseases. And they renamed it St. George's Island because they wanted it to be British. And you can see they built this palisade to keep all the local people out. It's very hard to recover impressions of how the local people felt when they saw all these white people arriving on their ship. Because there's very, very few written records, and the only versions we hear are from the Europeans. There are a few records. They thought the Europeans were very strange to row their boats backwards. I imagine that they also thought that Europeans were pretty silly to be wearing such warm clothing and boots and to be doing things like parading round a flagpole. The local people also wondered why they insisted on picking up certain flowers and bits of stone and paying great attention to them. And then from the British point of view, all the sailors thought that the women in Tahiti and the other Pacific islands were very compliant and were very eager to encounter the men sexually. From the women's point of view, it was completely different. There was a great shortage of iron on Tahiti. So what the women did was sell themselves for sex to the men, the British men, but in exchange, they got some metal. And so after a few weeks, an edict went out from the ship's carpenter saying that none of the sailors were allowed to remove any nails from the ship anymore because it was in danger of falling to bits. So there's a very different view that the British thought that they were taking advantage of the Tahitian women who found them irresistible, whereas from the Tahitian point of view, they were taking advantage of the British to get the metal, which they really needed very badly. They were there for 6 weeks. When he got back, Joseph Banks was intensively satirized. This is one of the many, many booklets that came out about him. And the picture on the right, the caption says, "Mr. Banks shows the Indians the planet Venus on the sun." If any of those Tahitians had looked through that telescope, they'd have been immediately blinded. So it's a bit of a strange picture. And he was often mocked and satirized when he came home for his sexual exploits, in particular with a local ruler who they wrongly called Queen Oberea. And there was one episode which became particularly famous and got recycled again and again and again, laughing at him, is when he spent the night on the boat with Queen Oberea, and when he got out in the morning, he'd left all his clothes neatly folded up in his canoe. Someone had stolen all his clothes, so he was in a real fix. And that might not seem particularly funny, but it became an anecdote that was just recycled the whole time after he got back to London. I'm sure he got fed up hearing about it. So in the end, they measured the transit of Venus, and then, unknown to Banks or to anybody, Cook had been carrying some secret instructions from the Admiralty. The Admiralty was funding the expedition. You can see here on the right, this is a picture of Cook that was commissioned by Banks, and he's holding a large chart of the Pacific. And there's a sort of cliche of saying that to map is to own. So Cook and the British Admiralty wanted to take possession of the Pacific area. And one of the ways that they did that was through mapping. And Cook's secret Admiralty instructions were about making discoveries of unknown countries, getting knowledge about distant parts. And then the key bit comes towards the end of this quotation: "will redound greatly to the honor of this nation as a maritime power." So this was an expedition about power, "and may tend greatly to the advancement of trade and navigation." So his instructions were, as soon as the observation of the transit of Venus should be finished, you are to proceed southward in order to discover Australia, because they wanted to establish a trade network and a military network in the middle of the Pacific. In order to reach Australia, they had to navigate their way around the Polynesian islands, which were completely uncharted. So they took with them a local Tahitian man called Tupaia. And he is the man who drew this picture. He drew several pictures, several other pictures as well. And the thing I really like about this picture is that it's symmetrical. It doesn't, unlike all the European pictures, it does not show white superiority. So Banks on the right is trading with the Maori. They're standing in a very similar posture. Banks is taking a crayfish. They desperately need the food to eat, and he's handing over to the Maori a Tahitian cloth. The Tahitians and the Maoris and all the other local people they met were far more interested in that sort of commodity than all the glass baubles and trinkets and everything else that Banks had taken up. Once he was walking through the bush in Australia, and he found this great heap of all this stuff that they'd taken out hidden behind a bush. And the local people understandably just were not interested in all this stuff coming out from England. So this is a lovely, lovely picture, I think. In contrast, when they got back, Banks's uncle commissioned the picture on the left by Benjamin West, the artist who's most famous for the death of Wolfe. And it shows Banks as a traveller, but you can see in the back behind his right shoulder, there's lots of Polynesian Pacific artifacts, which are now in the British Museum. And you can see he's wearing some sort of naval uniform underneath, but on top he's got a cloak wrapped around him. That's a New Zealand cloak. And he's pointing to the cloak because it's made of flax. And flax was one of the commodities that Britain really needed, because they, for building more ships, they needed wood and they needed flax for the sails. And it's a bit of a dark picture, but near his left foot, the bottom right hand of the picture, there's a book by Sydney Parkinson, who was his illustrator, and the book is open at the picture of flax. So this is a picture of Banks as a traveller, but it's also advertising the advantages of scientific exploration, the commercial advantages that would be brought to Britain by sending out other expeditions similar to that of the Endeavour. And on the right, there's a black and white engraving. And Banks himself had that made, he paid for it, because he wanted to use it as a form of publicity, as a form of counter-propaganda against some of the satires that were being brought out against him. So it came out very much at the same time as this picture on the left, which is called the Fly Catching Macaroni. And you can see he's straddling two halves of the globe. And the verse underneath says, I rove from pole to pole, I ask you why. I tell you truth to catch a butterfly. A butterfly was a symbol of something ephemeral, something that nobody really wanted, that was completely trivial. And so one of the ways that he tried to countermand all these caricatures and skits that came out about him was through controlling the pictures of himself that were shown. So there's a whole series of macaroni caricatures in the 70s and the 80s. So these are just two, there's hundreds of them. So the one on the left is a Marshall macaroni, the one on the right is a French one of a hairdresser. And they were generally mocking, parodying those rather etiolated young men who went out on their grand tour, came back from Italy and adopted rather affected behaviour and rather smart clothes and hung around not doing anything much very useful. So it was defined in one newspaper article, a macaroni is a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of the neuter gender. It talks without meaning, it smiles without pleasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion. And you can see him here in colour, chasing his butterfly and with wearing a very, very old-fashioned wig and sword, which people didn't do any longer at that time. There was quite a genre of pictures like this, which I find really interesting. It's a shop window in the street, and that was a way that everybody could see these caricatures, which were actually quite expensive to buy, but it meant that they were also very public as well. Even though if you were rich, you could buy one and you could put it on a screen in your house or on the wall on your house, or you put it in albums to show your friends. And if you look at the top left, you can just see probably there's that caricature of Joseph Banks as a macaroni that I've just been showing you. But there's several pictures which are similar to this, which are really a debate, a sort of visual debate about what it means to represent, because there's the caricatures in the shop window who are a sort of travesty of the real people. But then the people walking by in the street are also caricatures of normal people. They're not shown full face like a proper portrait would be. They're shown in profile, and they've got very, very exaggerated features. And then there's our status as a viewer. So there's quite a lot of sort of confusion and questions being asked about who's looking at whom and who it is exactly that's being parodied. So after that, Banks went to Iceland. I'm not going to talk about that. He had rather a row with James Cook and the Admiralty. So although James Cook went off again twice, Banks remained behind in London. And I'm going to talk now about the long period, 42 years, that he was president of the Royal Society. And he was definitely, as far as the Royal Society was concerned, he was definitely past his sell-by date at the end. And you see this picture that he commissioned of himself, looking very grand, very authoritarian. It's a very red, powerful picture. It's got the mace of the Royal Society in front of that red cushion and the inkwells and the feathers and everything. And you can see he's wearing a red sash and he's got a silver star on his left breast. And that's the order, as a star of the Order of the Bath, which he was always very, very proud of obtaining. And on the right, there's the motto of the Royal Society, which was founded in the middle of the 17th century. It says nullius in verba, which means take nothing on trust. Don't believe what anybody tells you. You've got to find out for yourself. And Banks, during all that 42 years, he didn't write any important scientific papers. He was often criticized by other members of the society because he was very, very unmathematical. He had no interest in physics or chemistry. They mocked him as a virtuoso who just collected shells and butterflies. On the other hand, what he did do was convince the government that science was very important. And he took the Royal Society into a far, far more influential, prestigious place than it had ever been before. And he was very powerful for controlling, supervising, directing government scientific policy. And he had lots of very, very rich friends, and he constantly wheeled them in and out on the committees of the Royal Society to make sure that his ideas and the scientific policies were carried through. So one of his achievements, for instance, was to make sure that they got new premises in Somerset House. So the Royal Academy was on one side of Somerset House, down by the Thames, where it still is. It's on the left in this picture. And the Royal Society had very, very grand chambers on the right. And that was something that he was able to influence because the government recognized the importance of science. He also had a very big correspondence network. He was living in Soho Square, which in a sense was sort of like the hub of the British imperial world. And he had over 3,000 correspondents, and 20,000 letters survive. There were probably far, far more that he wrote as well. And they weren't just letters. He was sending samples of minerals and fruits and seeds. He was organizing international politics, such as penal institutions in Australia or territory that was being seized in Africa. So he managed, through his correspondence network, he managed to exert a lot of power over the whole of the world. I'm going to just give you one example of a specific correspondence he had with one particular person, with Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was Charles Darwin's grandfather. He also proposed a theory of evolution. And like Banks, he was very keen on the botanical classification system of Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish classifier. And at the time, during the 18th century, many different schemes were being proposed for classifying plants and animals, but Linnaeus's was the one that stuck, and that was partly because it was publicized by Banks and by Erasmus Darwin. It's a system, it's why we're called Homo sapiens. It's that system where you've got two different words for describing specimens. So on the right, you can see Carl Linnaeus, who was also a great self-promoter. And he's dressed up here in an assembly of Sami costume. This was his own publicity picture. He loved reproducing it. Anybody who was Sami must have laughed themselves silly looking at it, because it's actually just a collection of tourist souvenirs and a mixture of things that were worn in the winter and the summer and that were worn by men and by women. He only spent 10 days in the Arctic Circle. The attitudes of southern Swedes like him towards the people who lived in the north was rather similar to what British attitudes were towards Africans. So it's a complete travesty, his costume. On the left is the first diagram of the classification system that he proposed. And unlike a lot of other classification systems, it was based on the sexual characteristics of plants. And you can see it, he's got 24 different drawings here. He set up 24 classes according to the number of stamens in the flower of a plant. And he subdivided those classes according to the number of pistils. But what he did was to say that the stamens were male and the pistils were female. So he replicated social organization, social hierarchies, by making the major category of classification was the male stamens, with the females being as subsidiaries. And then what happened after the Linnean system became consolidated as it is, and everybody believed that it was really true scientific knowledge, then people would turn and say, but in the natural world, men are superior to women, the stamens are superior to the pistils, and so therefore it has to remain like that. in the human world. I'll give you some examples of Banksia. The genus Banksia has got 170 different species, a lot of them Banks brought back with him from Australia. If you're ever lucky enough to see the herbarium either in Cambridge or in the Natural History Museum, there's hundreds and hundreds of these specimens there. So this is sort of like the national flower of Australia. That's one example. That's another example. And that's a third, but I could show you 170. His illustrator was Sydney Parkinson. And I've juxtaposed these two pictures. You can see a botanical specimen on the right, and on the left, there's a Maori with a beautiful tattooed face. And I think it's an interesting picture because it shows from the European perspective that collecting people and collecting and illustrating flowers were two equivalent activities. They're both set in the same way. There's no words, they're set against blank pieces of paper like specimens that have been very, very closely observed in great detail. And a few years after Banks came back, Cook went on a second voyage to Tahiti. And this time he brought back with him the man on the left, who was called Omai. And he handed him over to Banks, and it was Banks's responsibility to take him on a tour around England. And he was sort of showing him off as a curious specimen. And you can see here, he's in his own house. And this picture illustrates quite well 3 different perspectives on Omai's relationship with the British nation. So in the middle, you've got Joseph Banks with that very sort of possessive gesture. His responsibility is to take Omai around, show him to the king, show him off, introduce him to Britain. On the left is a man called Daniel Solander. Solander he was a pupil of Linnean, a Linnean disciple, and he'd gone to Australia with Banks and Cook. But now, by this stage, he was a curator at the British Museum. And you can see he's got his pen in his hand and he's looking at Omai and he's observing him and he's writing down all the details about him as though he were a specimen to be catalogued. And the description still survives of his height, the color of his skin, the shape of his nose, all those sort of details, just as though he were another natural specimen. And then you can see Omai himself on the left, who's standing very proud and very aloof, and he's dressed in that sort of classical drapery. And that's because a lot of the Pacific Islanders were regarded as what was then called a noble savage. Europeans had this double view of the Pacific Islanders. On the one hand, obviously, from their point of view, anybody who wasn't European had to be uncivilized and they had to be savage. So there was a sort of savage aspect. There was this view that that British people could look down on them. But at the same time, they hadn't been corrupted by Western civilization. So they were often said to be pure and innocent and as a continuation of the original paradise. So there was this sort of dichotomous shifting view of how Europeans viewed indigenous peoples, and that was summarized in their terms, not my term, but the vocabulary of the time was that they were a noble savage. And you can see in detail on Omai's left hand, you can see the tattooing on his hand, which quite fascinated people. I mentioned earlier that Banks was very keen on controlling his own portraiture. So this is a picture on the left, that I showed you before. And the picture on the right, you can see it's by the same artist. It was painted about 20 years later. And I apologize, I hope I don't upset whoever put it on the website, but I was really interested to see that this was a picture that had been chosen to advertise this talk, because Banks himself kept this picture extremely private, because you can see he's got a stick. He spent the last 10 years of his life in a wheelchair. He was very overweight. He had terrible gout. He could really hardly walk at all. So the one on the right was a very private picture. that nobody outside his immediate household ever saw. The picture on the left was how he wanted to advertise himself for many, many years after it had actually been painted. And he got quite concerned because a lot of engravers copied this picture, and you can see by some of the ones that I've shown on the right that it was quite easy to travesty it and produce rather sort of strange, distorted versions. So Banks decided that he was going to get the best engraver in town, and that was Chavanetti. And so it was this version of Banks's portrait that he made sure was disseminated, showing the sash and the order of the Knight of the Bath. But he couldn't control everything. And James Gillray produced this caricature, which personally I think is much more interesting and much more fun. And you can see he's sort of emerging from the banks, from the island of Tahiti, like a Bath butterfly. And this is the caption underneath, which you can't read. It says, "The new Bath butterfly first crawled into notice from among the weeds and the mud on the banks," note the typical 18th century joke, the banks, ha-ha, of the South Sea. "It's noticed and valued solely on account of the beautiful red which encircles its body and the shining spot on its breast, distinction which never fails to render caterpillars valuable." And he's mocking Banks because he was so proud of this distinction, which was usually only given to great military commanders. And then you can see that colossal sun in the background, and that's the son of King George, and the butterflies are basking in the warmth of royal favour. And you can see on his wings, there's all these little sort of starfish and other things, because he's mocked as a collector. And then near his left shoulder, there's a bonnet rouge, the bonnet rouge of the French revolutionaries. So Banks was a great imperialist. So I'm going to move on, finally, the final part, to talk about Metropolis and Empire. And this is obviously a 19th century map, but right in the middle, there's England, and you can imagine right in the middle of that, there's Banks sitting in Soho Square in London and busy trying to help organise all those red splodges which have appeared in various parts of the world and which came to form the British Empire. One of the ways he was able to do that, and this is an aspect of Banks that the hagiographies usually leave out, is that he was a great clubman. Unlike French society, where there was salons which were run by women, and there was a very mixed society, London society was very split, and Banks was very much part of this homosocial crowd, as historians call it, of men who met in groups alone. So these are two different colour pictures, again by Reynolds, of the Society of Dilettanti. I've just shown you one in colour and one in black and white. They were both engraved, like the one on the right. And the Banks is in the one on the right, and he's the man on the very, very far right of the picture when he was still pretty young. The picture on the left is ostensibly to celebrate William Hamilton, who had returned from Italy and had found lots of antique vases. That's his book on the table, which they're showing off, of antique vases. But the man in the middle with his hand held up is actually holding up a lady's garter. And then the group on the right are celebrating fine wines. And if you can decode it, they are holding their hands, their thumbs and their forefingers in very distinctive signs. There was a whole language of signs. So he, as well as being the austere autocratic president of the Royal Society, he was also very much a bon vivant, a member of London society, and that actually helped him in all his wheeling and dealing. And I think while he was enjoying himself at these drinking parties, there was also a lot of business going on at the same time behind the scenes. One of the things that he was very involved in was Kew Gardens, which belonged to George III. You can see the famous pagoda here. It's built by William Chambers, the same man who built Somerset House next to the Thames. And Banks was effectively the Director General of Kew Gardens. He's very, very instrumental in setting it up. And you can see on the left, there's George III, and Banks was very, very friendly both with George III and with his wife, Queen Caroline. And I've just shown on the right two aspects of how he influenced Kew Gardens. So at the top, there's a rare flower, which has been imported from South Africa, and Banks named it, and he named it Strelitzia regina, and he named it after Queen Caroline. So he paid tribute to the Queen in this Linnean classification, but it was also helped to set up all the flower beds and all the greenhouses and all the marvelous things that you can see at Kew Gardens now. It was also then not just a botanical garden, it was also used for breeding. Breeding sheep, and there were lots of experimental breeding going on. There's some merino sheep, which you can see at the bottom. And Banks was very instrumental in that activity. He was a farmer from Lincoln. He knew what he was doing. And he and King George spent a lot of time doing that together. He was also very instrumental in what I've called ecological imperialism. It's not my term, it's somebody else's. This idea that you can move plants which are indigenous to one particular part of the world, you can move them to another part of the world. So for example, we sent sheep and rabbits to Australia, but then also crops like wheat or animals like English cows started appearing in Australia and New Zealand and Canada and various places that the British colonized. And he was also responsible for sending Captain Bligh to take, as the quotation shows you. So they sent a ship to Tahiti. They took the breadfruit, that's what's in the picture, take it to the West Indies. That was a failed experiment, even when it managed to get there after the mutiny on the Bounty. And then there was a whole network of botanic gardens. From his base in London, Banks was able to control those. So there were plants going from St. Vincent's to Bengal. He's going to set up another one at Madras. So he was very much an international wheeler and dealer in the botanical world, not just in terms of scientific botany, but also in determining the crops that were going to be grown and how a lot of British imports and exports. He was one of the very few people who'd been to Australia, so he was regarded as an expert, and he was responsible for recommending that the first fleet of prisoners go out to Australia and settle in Botany Bay in 1788. He was also very much involved in developing Africa. And this is one of the sort of standard 18th century map of Australia. You can see that large band, which is pretty much unexplored by Europeans, called Negro Land. And south of that, there's this area called Guinea. And it was the name Guinea, the area, that gave its name to the British coin, the guinea. And you can see that the way the Europeans have drawn the different territories within Guinea is got nothing to do with the local people. They've all been labeled in terms of what Europeans can gain by exploiting the land. So on the left, the west, there's the grain coast, then going across there's the gold coast, and then there's the slave coast, and there's also the ivory coast. So he was on the founding committee of the Association for the Discovery of Africa. It's got a very, very long title, but he played a very key role in developing Africa for the British nation. So this is on the Gold Coast, what's called the Gold Coast, now called Ghana. It's called Cape Coast Castle. And it was our biggest fortress on the coast of Africa. You can see it's that sort of triangular shape with the cannon looking out over the sea to defend it from other Europeans who were trying to invade. You can see on the left, there's the top floors, what's visible of the castle. And that was where there was a huge British settlement living out there, and everybody lived very comfortably. And then down in the basement, underneath that, is a picture on the bottom right, it's very dark, and that was where all the captive slaves were kept before they were shipped out to the plantations across the Atlantic. And there was the door out of that was called the door of no return. And I'm going to show you a quotation which contains words and also sentiments, which some of you might find rather offensive. So I want to emphasize that it's a quotation. They're Joseph Banks' words, they're not my words. And also, I know it's a very contentious area, but my personal belief is that we have to look at quotations and sentiments like these in order to understand and to confront how it is that the British Empire was developed. So if you don't want to look at and listen at the quotation, please turn away. So this is what Joseph Banks wrote. As the trade with Negroes, with Africans, is already established, and because there's lots of gold, then what the British government has got to do is, he said, we've got to secure, to capture a long stretch of the coast of Africa. And then he said, we can set up a trading company, which the government can control. And then he gave it a really nice twist. He said, well, of course, as British people, we'll govern the local people far more mildly and make them happier than they are now under the control of their princes. And also, we can convert them to the to the Christian religion. So I've shown you several different views of Joseph Banks. So I'll just finish with these two. And in general terms, his reputation has shifted enormously during the 200 years since his death. Immediately after his death, during the Victorian era, he was very much dismissed as an old-fashioned aristocrat. And then in the early 20th century, he was revived by Australian historians. And until towards the end of the 20th century, all the books about Joseph Banks were written by Australians. And then there was a great flurry of interest by me and by other people in him as an English hero. And then I think the last 10, 20 years, everybody, including me, has become far more interested in seeing him as an agent of empire and discussing that aspect of his activities, which used to be completely glossed over. So you can see him on the left as a way, an image of this imperializing aspect, standing on his two globes. His picture on the right is by John Russell. And this was Banks's own favorite picture. And he told people at the Royal Society that everybody should buy a picture and hang it on the wall. And that picture that he's holding in front of him is actually a map of the moon. So I sort of always like to think of that as, well, he's there with the map of the moon. So perhaps his real imperial intentions weren't just to take over the whole of the world for Britain, but also to colonize the moon as well. So I'm going to stop there. And then I understand that Bill and Martha are going to be collating questions, and then I'll try to answer them.
Thank you, Patricia. Really enjoyed that. Very thought-provoking. I'll get my video back going. Very thought-provoking, especially in the current environment. And so I imagine as people reflect on what you've said, they'll have some questions. And I thought I'd start, and I think you were touching on it. So there are a lot of paintings and about empire, about exploration, statues. These people were heroes and so forth at one time, but now understand in a more complex manner. What's your view? Do we keep these things up on the walls, but just understand them in a different way? Do they move? What's your view?
My personal opinion is that we should keep these statues. I mean, I'm not sure I feel like that about the guy Colston who was toppled in Bristol, but the Rhodes statue, for example, seeing we're in Cambridge, he's an Oxbridge person. I think it's actually a very dangerous step to try to whitewash the past. I think what we've got to do is just contemplate what Rhodes did. He did a lot of good things. A lot of people believed that he was an extremely worthwhile man, otherwise they wouldn't have put the statue up. So I think he has to be there as a reminder that our attitudes have changed, and also, no doubt, in 200 years' time, whoever it is that we're putting up as statues now will also be criticised by people in the future, because it's no use thinking that we've got the absolute answer, that we're totally superior to all the civilizations that have preceded us. We're not. And it's disguising the past. I think it's partly why I'm a historian. I think we have to learn from the past, not try to erase it and pretend that it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's one of the great joys of being a historian, is that you can, I mean, there's always new facts to find, and sort of playing Sherlock Holmes and finding out the new facts in archives is a very exciting part of being a historian, of a historian's work. But the really exciting bit, and the reason why fundamentally I changed from doing physics to doing history, is that you can interpret what you find and you can give it your own personal flavor. So over the last 50 years, we've seen, for example, great interest first in working class, and then in women, and now in ethnicity and imperialism. There's always new ways of looking at things, which is fascinating. And there's no definitive right answer for looking at the past.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a lot of people out there, but it's a quiet group in terms of questions. I think they're trying to come up with something good for you. Let me ask you, we ran into you a couple of weeks ago and asked how you were doing. How is the life of a historical researcher in lockdown, and how are you coping not being able to get to collections?
Well, I've been writing a lot, obviously, based on what I can find out through the internet, through Google. I must say my Amazon bill has rocketed, because I've bought quite a few books that I normally wouldn't have bought. It is very frustrating not being able to get to libraries. I must confess, I'm slightly fed up reading in the newspapers and the Times Literary Supplement and things like that. I'm slightly fed up reading my memoirs of the lockdown, and I've sworn that I'm not going to write one of those.
Good. Are you able to use digital collections in your research when things are closed? Are you finding some of the new digital libraries?
Yes. So what I've been doing, I'm at a very funny in-between period, because I finished a book about Isaac Newton, and it's with the publisher, and it's coming out next February, when I hope that I will be able to emerge from lockdown and talk to Claire and everyone else about the book. And so I tried to devise a project that was compatible with lockdown. And so I've chosen a set of about 50 scientific caricatures. A couple of them I've shown in this talk that I've just given now. And my plan is to put them in chronological order, and for each one of them, write a piece, an essay of about 1,000 words, which explains the controversies that were happening at the time. Because I think nowadays, if you look at a Gillray, I mean, if I hadn't talked to you about that picture of Banks, nobody would have had any idea what it meant. So that is my plan. I haven't yet got a publisher. So if anybody out there who's listening is a publisher and would like this book, it's all ready to go, bar from about 5 where I need a library.
Sounds wonderful. Well, good. Since we've been talking, that spurred some people into action. Elizabeth asks, I keep hearing about decolonizing science and mathematics. What do you think that means?
Decolonizing science and mathematics. I don't think there is any precise definition. I think it means different things to different people. I think decolonizing the history of science and mathematics, I think, is very different from decolonizing what's happening now. If you look at most scientific projects now, even though there is a lot of scientific training going on in various countries around the world, the vast majority of the funding and the actual research is taking place in a few major countries, like notably America and increasingly China. I think in terms of the history of mathematics and science, it's rather like it's a lot that I've written about the role of women in science. It means telling a different sort of history. Oh, it's that cliche that history is always written by the victors. But I think so decolonizing the history and the history of science and mathematics means looking again at all the very real contributions of places in different parts of the world and not comparing them with what was happening in Europe, but instead showing how valid and how important they were, but not necessarily in the same way as what was happening in Europe. And I think that's the same with women as well. They were making important contributions, but it's obviously different from the privileged middle-class men who went to university. And it's the same for colonial matters as well.
And that's become a part of your work too, hasn't it?
Oh, it has, very much so. So this new book I'm writing about Newton, well, that I've written about Newton, the third section is about his activities as the head of the mint and all the gold that was coming back from Africa and our relationships with the trade in enslaved peoples. So yes, I've become very interested in that.
So question, in your research on banks, what surprised you most?
Oh gosh, what an interesting question. What surprised me most? I think to realize how multifaceted he was, because I'd only ever heard of him when I started. I'd only ever heard of him as the botanist who went to Australia with James Cook. And then gradually I realized, for one thing, how important he was as a local landowner, which is something that I haven't really talked about today. And agriculture was a major part of the British economy in the 18th century, so he was important for that. And then to discover that he controlled the Botanic Gardens and then all over the world, and then to find out who's involved in Africa, he was involved in what was happening in Australia, and with this huge network of international correspondence. So it's sort of like almost anything that you look at, Banks crops up somewhere or other. So for example, when I was doing this project on caricatures last week, I was reading about a man called Perkins who had these metal rods. They were called tractors, and the idea was that you drew them down over your body and you sort of drew out all the pain magnetically. And then I was just reading about him, and there was Joseph Banks. Joseph Banks had breakfast with his friend last week, and they spent the whole time laughing about Perkins tractors. And he was a man that was just around everywhere.
So it sounds like he was a celebrity, really.
Oh, he was very famous, yes.
Should current people in this space be? Is it a shame? What's the situation in your view with current celebrity status of people in equivalent positions today? Was it good that he was celebrated and charactered in a way, because it meant there was attention to what he was doing?
I think he was a celebrity when he came back from Newfoundland, because if you think about the realities of traveling to somewhere like Canada or to Australia, it needed a huge amount of courage. It was a really frightening thing to do, and the likelihood of dying was pretty high. So it would be, in that sense, it would be the equivalent of, well, not quite of the astronauts who landed on the moon, but certainly the sort of polar explorers who sort of trek across the Arctic all on their own. Certainly it would be, I think, in the equivalent of that, partly because there was no radio. I mean, they were just doing it completely on their own. Or another equivalent would be Amy Johnson when she flew to Australia. So the way she flew to Australia was she got out the map and she put the ruler on the map and drew a straight line from England to Australia, and then sort of set off. And she had no radio. She had no real proper navigation equipment. She was in an open cockpit, and she had to fly for at least 8 hours and not deviate from the route, or there wouldn't be any fuel for her when she landed. And I think to set off in that sort of way is something that doesn't exist anymore. That sort of exploration is no longer feasible, and it's absolutely not something I would want to do myself, but I can see why it's worth celebrating.
Here's a great question. Is anything to be learned from the equally dismal undergraduate performances of Banks and Darwin?
Well, I'm not senior tutor anymore, so
I was going to say.
I don't have to toe the party line, do I? That academic performance is not everything that it takes to be a great person. But on the other hand, if you are interested in intellectual activity, then having the privilege to come to a place like Oxford or Cambridge is just absolutely wonderful. And it's a great privilege, and it sort of feels, sort of going into the university library and writing books and giving lectures and talking to undergraduates feels like great self-indulgence, actually, because it's a thing I like doing best in the world and I'm paid to do it.
Do undergraduates have enough time and space do they make enough time and space to pursue their individual interests and passions these days?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Undergraduates now, oh yes. I mean, I don't want to start naming names, but I'm sure all the people listening either have themselves indulged passions or know people who have. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about having long vacations, for example, all the things that the students do during the summer. And although as senior tutor, of course, I didn't know about it, but I'm sure there were students doing all sorts of things that they shouldn't have been doing, just like I did when I was an undergraduate. So yeah, I think being here, some students choose to spend their whole 3 or 4 years absolutely dedicated to working, to studying, and that's fine. And then others use their time here in a more creative way. But what's always stunned me all the time that I've been teaching is how incredibly talented our students are and how much information they absorb so quickly and how skilled they are at assessing it and probing it and weighing up different possibilities. I mean, it's one of the great joys of teaching here is just the students are wonderful. And I'm not saying that, I know that's what development people are meant to say. I'm saying it totally genuinely, unprompted by you. I really, really mean that. And a lot of us, you know, when we're sitting up at high table, that's what we say to each other quite often, that these students are just amazing.
So another question. Was Banks interested in the ecological ideas of Alexander Humboldt, or as an ecological imperialist? Did he have any evident interest in the impact of his transplants on their new homes?
I'm not sure how well he knew Humboldt's work. I've never really, because Humboldt was sort of, he was certainly still alive. I've never heard much about him, being much in contact with him. I think he was interested in the ecological impact, certainly in the sense that he thought it would be a good idea to use other countries to transplant plants and animals and minerals from one place to another. So he was certainly interested in the ecological impact in that way. There was a lot of experimentation going on. So Carl Linnaeus, for example, thought it would be a really good idea to rescue the Swedish economy because Sweden depended on some very expensive imports like coffee and silk and bananas and things like that. And what he imagined, he sent out his Linnean disciples, people like Daniel Solander and Banks, and they sent samples back from all over the world to Uppsala. And what Linnaeus tried to do was persuade them to grow in the Swedish climate. He actually managed to get a banana tree to grow in Sweden. And he had visions of the tundra being covered with all these crops, and he imported silkworms because he thought he could push China out of the silkworm business and produce their own silk. But of course, unsurprisingly, it didn't work. So I think they certainly wanted to change the world. I mean, that was a responsibility that had been given them in the Bible, and many people still took their moral code very strongly from the Bible. And in the Bible, human beings are told that the world is theirs to look after, but also to use for their own benefit. So there was very much a sense of responsibility that they should be looking after the world. They were custodians of the world, but they should also be taking advantage of it as well. So there was, I think, that ecological urge. It didn't have that name. Ecology wasn't invented till the 19th century, but I think the sort of impulse is there, yeah.
Thank you. Well, thanks for your questions today, everybody. And Patricia, thank you
Oh, thank you
for
for coming
brilliant
and thank
talk
you for
and
listening.
a good conversation, and for continuing to be such an important part of our college. And it really means a lot. I also just want, since it's the end of the live sessions this week, I just want to thank my team in the office who helped pull this together. We normally try and do this tomorrow on a Saturday at the end of term. But obviously we couldn't do that under the current circumstances. So we changed course. We've gotten on Zoom. We've learned how to do this. And Sophie Baker in particular from the team, but all the team have been a huge help in making sure this has gone pretty smoothly this week. We've got some more talks tomorrow. We're going to be doing an online celebration for the students who would have graduated. We will have them back for proper graduation, but we're doing that tomorrow. And that will really, in a way, conclude the academic year. And we are getting ready to get back in session if we can. That's the plan in October, with some things like big lectures digital, but hopefully getting students back into the Thurko room where you are. So grateful to all the kind words that people are sending in and for everybody's participation. And again, to you, Patricia. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope to be seeing everybody soon. Everybody who's listening, I hope next year they'll be here back in college,
Absolutely.
minus the scaffolding.
Bye now.
Bye.